The Wicker Man. Depending on which generation you're from, and if you've seen the Wicker Man movie, you're picturing one of two things right now. Either the iconic Christopher Lee with a really creepy smile sacrificing Howie, or Nicolas Cage screaming,
"Oh, no, not the beast! Not the beast! Ah!"
Or how about Nicolas Cage punching that woman in the face while wearing a bear costume? That's pretty peak Nicolas Cage as well. Or maybe both. Maybe you're thinking about both. Maybe you love both films like I do. They have the same basic story and plot, but two completely different vibes. And if you've never seen the Wicker Man movies, then you have to. You absolutely have to. You have to watch them both. The first is a classic piece of folk horror, heavy emphasis on the folk, and the second is Nicolas Cage at the end of his Action Man era and the beginning of his eccentric era. So both versions are worthy of your time in their own ways, so definitely check them out if you haven't. But did you know that there is a real life history behind the Wicker Man? And I don't mean a secretive and slightly off-putting group of islanders sacrificing people. Not that. But could there be truth to the idea of trapping someone inside a giant wicker figure of a man and setting them on fire? So for today's story, we're traveling back to the classical world, actually, because according to none other than Julius Caesar, in his commentary on the Gallic War written in the 1st century BCE, the Celtic Gauls did just that. First, we'll go through the historical context of the time. Why was Caesar fighting against the Gauls? And after we've established that, we'll take a look at the source in question. Then, once we've got all the information we need, we'll decide whether or not we can trust this source, whether it was corroborated by anyone else, and if there's been any archaeological evidence proving the existence of a Wicker Man, and therefore proving if the Wicker Man was a real thing, outside of the film industry and Nicolas Cage's nightmares. So let's get started. So first, let's understand the context of today's history. Why was Caesar in Gaul, where he claims that the Celts there performed human sacrifice with a Wicker Man? Well, to do this, we need a short-ish history lesson on the Roman Republic, not empire. This all happened before Rome transitioned officially to an empire. Rome became a republic in 509 BCE when a group of nobles rebelled against the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud. The Etruscans, to keep it as brief as possible, were the group that ruled in central Italy before the Romans. And once the Roman nobles defeated the Etruscans and chased them out of power, they formed a new government built on a system of checks and balances. There was a senate, there were some citizen assemblies, and 2 elected executives, known as the consuls. Now, over time, Rome sought to expand its territory, and this is, by the way, like step 2 for building a prosperous civilization. First, you need to build legitimacy, because there needs to be a buy-in for why people should live and peacefully exist in your civ. And once that's squared away, you engage in territorial expansion. Why? Well, expanding your civ means access to more laborers, more natural resources, and even greater political legitimacy. And countries still to this day engage in territorial expansion by invasions and going to war. But let's not go there. Rome fought in a bunch of wars to expand their territory in these Republic days, perhaps the most famous being the Punic Wars, where the Romans absolutely destroyed their North African neighbors, the Carthaginians, in 3 different wars spanning from 264 to 146 BCE. These are the ones with the Carthaginian general Hannibal and his war elephants against the Roman generals Scipio Africanus, all that good stuff. And by the end of these wars, Carthage was destroyed, its people enslaved, and Rome became the de facto main power in the Mediterranean. And I am grossly simplifying and shortening all of this, of course, because I want to get to why Caesar ends up in Gaul. I'm just trying to establish the idea that the Romans engage in territorial expansion through warfare, and they're very good at it. So Caesar ends up coming to power in 60 BCE as part of the first triumvirate, a ruling group of 3 consuls instead of the normal 2, along with Pompey and Crassus. So why buck tradition and go with 3 instead of 2? Well, in short, again, grossly simplifying all of this, it was an alliance of sorts made to counter the growing power and influence of the Senate. They felt that despite their system of checks and balances, the power was skewed too far towards the Senate, towards the legislative body. So, these 3 men came together as consuls to try and rebalance things. At least that's what they told people. In reality, they just wanted power for themselves, not to support the dream that was the Roman Republic.
There was a dream that was Rome.
Caesar and Pompey were very powerful generals, and Crassus was very wealthy, and they were all really popular with the common people, which rubbed the Senate the wrong way. And most of you know how all of this eventually goes down anyway for Caesar on March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March.
What are you waiting for? Now! Now! Now!
But once Caesar came to power, he decided to go to war against the Gauls, which is in today's France, Belgium, Netherlands, and a few chunks of Germany, Rome's northwestern neighbors. But why? Well, like I said before, political legitimacy and territorial expansion. Conquering the Gauls would make Caesar even more powerful, popular, prestigious, wealthy, all things that would help him eventually take full control of Rome, which, spoiler alert, we know he does. So in 58 BCE, he set off to Gaul for 8 years, where he encountered and then defeated them. His return to Rome was epic, too. The first triumvirate by then had fallen apart. Pompey had tried to prevent his return, fearing his growing power. There was a physical and metaphorical crossing of the Rubicon River as he marched his troops into Rome, which was an act of declaring war. He took power. It's all really good and really interesting stuff. But that's not why we're here. Have to remember that. We're here to pinpoint where exactly the Wicker Man first appeared in the historical record, and if the source is to be believed, it happened during Caesar's campaign in Gaul. So let's take a look at the primary source, and then we'll dissect it and go over any extra information we need to get a more complete picture of the Wicker Man. In Book 6 of Caesar's Commentaries on the Gallic War, we get the following passage. Quote, "The nation of all the Gauls is extremely devoted to superstitious rites, and on that account, they who are troubled with unusually severe diseases and they who are engaged in battles and dangers either sacrifice men as victims or vow that they will sacrifice them, and employ the druids as performers of those sacrifices. Because they think that unless the life of a man be offered for the life of a man, the mind of the immortal gods cannot be rendered propitious, and they have sacrifices of that kind ordained for national purposes. Others have figures of vast size, the limbs of which formed of osiers that they fill with living men, which being set on fire, the men perish enveloped in flames. They consider that the oblation of such as have been taken in theft or in robbery or any other offense is more acceptable to the immortal gods, but when a supply of that class is wanting, they have recourse to the oblation of even the innocent." End quote. That's it. That's the source that mentions the Wicker Man. But before we try to corroborate it, let's break it down so we're all on the same page with what it's telling us. So Caesar, or his writer at least, is telling us here that the Gauls are superstitious folk. When someone is sick, or is about to go to battle, or if there's some kind of danger, they give a human sacrifice to their gods. And they feel that unless they give their gods that sacrifice, the gods won't protect them. So they do this regularly to keep the gods happy, so the Gauls can steer clear of disease and death in battle. And to perform this ritual, they use druids. More on them in a bit. Now, one way a sacrifice could happen, according to this source, is with a, quote, figure of vast size. The thing is made with osiers, which are small willow trees that provide fibers used for things like basket weaving. Hence, the later connotation of wicker man, wicker baskets, right? The sacrifice victims are then put into the limbs, the whole thing is set on fire, and the ritual is complete. They try to use criminals for the sacrifice, but if there aren't any robbers or thieves available, they will sacrifice the innocent. Okay, so now what I want to know after reading that source and breaking it down a little bit is, who are the druids, right? I want to know a little bit more about the druids. I want to know more about the Gauls' belief in human sacrifice and where all of this comes from, which is Celtic culture. So let's dive even deeper into the history to explore the Celts. The term Celts refers to a collection of people who came from areas throughout Western Europe. One might initially assume that the Celts only belonged to Ireland, Scotland, Wales, maybe parts of England, but the earliest known evidence of the Celts comes from around 700 BCE from an excavated grave in Austria. And we have sources that place the Celts from areas near the Danube River all the way over to France, and even a Greek source that recounts a meeting between the Celts and Alexander the Great in the Balkans in 335 BCE. So, Celts is a term that we give to that collection of people because they share a similar language and culture and some beliefs. They weren't just one group of people, they didn't look one kind of way, they were a whole different bunch of tribes, is my point. And we don't know what they might have called themselves, but the Roman word Celt is what stuck. And before anyone comes for me in the comments, I know the Romans took that word from the Greek Keltoi, but we use the Roman spelling. And in fact, before the 18th century, we didn't even really call them the Celts. For example, the Celts from the British Isles were known as the Britons.
Who goes there? It is I, Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon from the castle of Camelot, king of the Britons.
And today, of course, we're talking about the Gauls, a Celtic group from mainly France. I will reiterate that the Greeks were the first to write about them going back to 540 BCE, but much of what we know about the classical era Celts and the Gauls and druids in general comes from the Romans, sources like the one I read earlier. But I want to focus on Gaulish cultural beliefs, which will bring us to the Wicker Man, because otherwise I could be here all day talking about the classical era. Now, at the heart of Celtic beliefs is the druid, a shaman of sorts that would commune with the spirit world, was connected heavily with the natural world, and used holistic medicines to cure, or sometimes cause, illnesses. But beyond being a spiritual medium, druids were teachers and scientists and philosophers. They were highly respected and often were sought out to mediate disputes and maintain order. And also of note, because I find this interesting, there were male and female druids, and they were equally respected and seen as all-powerful, which pretty cool. Now, here's what Caesar tells us of the druids in Gaul from that same source. Quote, "Throughout all Gaul, there are two orders of men who are of any rank and dignity. One is that of the druids, and the other that of the knights. The former are engaged in things sacred, conduct the public and private sacrifices, and interpret all matters of religion. They determine, respecting all controversies, public and private, and if any crime has been perpetrated, if murder has been committed, if there be any dispute about an inheritance, if any about boundaries, they decide it. They teach and impart to the youth many things respecting the stars and their motion, respecting the extent of the world and of our earth, respecting the nature of things, respecting the power and majesty of the important gods." End quote. And then he goes on to say the thing about the giant burning man-shaped effigy filled with men in like the next paragraph down. So if our image of a druid comes from sources like this, how can we be certain that they're true? Indeed, much of what we think about the Celts, and more specifically the Gallic druids, was exaggerated, as we don't really have a lot of Gallic primary sources. Gaulish, their language, was primarily spoken. It was written down in other scripts, like Greek and Latin, but that means that there was a heavy Greek or Latin influence or bias on those sources. So, in short, we don't have a properly Gallic source that confirms anything that Caesar says here. But we do know a bunch about the Celts more broadly because of their traditions that survived, like celebrating the Yule winter solstice or the Litha summer solstice. And then there's the 4 fire festivals, right? Imbolc, Beltina, Lunasa, and Samhain. I talked about all of those in my episode on the history of Halloween, so go check that out if you're interested in more Celtic culture. We also know from Roman sources that the druids were oppressed by the Romans in the 1st century CE, supposedly because of the whole human sacrifice thing. And by the 2nd century, druidism was more or less over. But again, much of what we know about the druids and the Gauls and human sacrifices and the Wicker Man comes from Roman sources. So given all of that information, the next point is, can we trust Caesar's source? What do we know about this source and its purpose? It's really important to consider that when reading or listening to something. Was there perhaps an agenda? Is it biased? Well, first, let's actually look at a Greek writer named Posidonius. A few decades before Caesar went on his campaign against the Gauls, Posidonius went around the Mediterranean to gather data on the non-Greek speaking peoples, as well as some scientific data like tidal heights and how they went along with the moon's orbit, stuff like that. And one of the places that Posidonius went was Gaul, where he interacted with the Celts and took note of some of their customs. He wrote about how they would nail skulls to doorways as trophies, which is pretty badass, and how in the past, men were given money to have their own throats cut open in public for amusement, which seems a bit extreme and probably not real. He labeled these actions, of course, barbaric, and I'm sure many people who read his works agree with that. But he also noted that the druids were philosophers and well respected in their communities. He apparently wrote this really broad geographic survey of the Celts, but that document has been lost to history. Instead, that survey has been referenced by others after him, including Caesar. And historians believe that Caesar actually got his information about the Wicker Man from Posidonius's very biased survey. And this is strengthened by the fact that Caesar's only mention of the Wicker Man is that one line, which I'll mention again, quote, "Others have figures of vast size, the limbs of which formed of osiers, they fill with living men, which being set on fire, the men perish enveloped in flames." End quote. Had Caesar actually witnessed this, I'm sure he would have written much more about it. I can't imagine a world where he would have seen a giant hollow wicker effigy stuffed with bodies and set on fire and just been like, "Ah, well, just another Tuesday," and then moved on with his life. That probably would have gotten more than a single sentence, more than a quick mention in his memoirs on the Gallic Wars, right? I mean, sure, the Gallic Wars were full of important life-altering events for Caesar, like the capture of the Gallic hero and leader Vercingetorix during the Battle of Alesia in 52 BCE. I did a joint podcast episode, by the way, on that battle with the Engineering History podcast, but that's audio only and not on YouTube for those of you interested in listening to it, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. But anyways, it's important to note that not once did Caesar talk about the Britons using the Wicker Man to do human sacrifices, right? Just the Gauls, and just in that one sentence. That doesn't necessarily discount it. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Not all Celts were identical, and living in different regions will yield different cultural practices. So just because the Gauls might have done it does not mean that the Britons did it too. So, okay, bigger picture. This source seems a little dubious to me, right? But why lie about it? Why even mention something like this if he didn't see it at all? To answer that question, we can just go back and look at biases. Now, this is well before Christianity took off, both in general and in Rome, so in this case, it's not about slandering them as pagans. They were all pagans. But instead, think back to Rome and their desire to gain political legitimacy and territory. By othering the Gauls, by making them seem foreign and weird and different from the Romans, it allowed Caesar to gain even more popularity back home while on his crusade against them. It was the same with the capture of Vercingetorix at Alesia 52 BCE. He was held prisoner for almost 6 years, brought out as a trophy when Caesar returned home and had his triumph, which is a ceremonial parade. And only after those 6 years, after all of that, after Caesar squeezed all he could out of Vercingetorix's capture, was the poor man strangled to death in 46 BCE. My point is that Caesar was concerned with his own power, so by writing about the Gauls in the way that he did, including small hearsay details like burning their own men in sacrifice, it painted a picture of them being this backwards, brutal group. So, all the better for Caesar to go and conquer them, right?
People should know when they're conquered.
Would you, Quintus? Would I?
The more barbaric they seemed, the more popular Caesar was for defeating them in battle. Okay, so we can't really trust this source, and it wasn't properly corroborated by any source after Caesar's either. But I do have more questions. Did the Gauls, or perhaps the Celts more broadly, engage in human sacrifice? Maybe not through a Wicker Man, but did they do human sacrifice in general? Probably yes, but even that is debatable. We have some archaeological evidence to suggest that human sacrifice might have happened, but that evidence could also just show violent death, not one specifically meant to be a sacrifice to the gods. One example, sometimes attributed to sacrifice, is the Lindau Man, a body found preserved in a peat bog in England. It was discovered in the 1980s in Cheshire, which is not too far from Manchester. The Lindau Man clearly died a violent death. They found a V-shaped cut in the top of his head, which was caused by a blunt object, ligature marks on his neck, a possible stab wound in the upper right chest, a broken neck, a broken rib. The force of the blow to the head sent chunks of skull into his brain. There was evidence of swelling as well, which means that the blow happened before he died. It's not clear if the other things happened before death or posthumously, and we're never really going to know that. But we do know that after his death, he was put in the Lindau moss peat bog face down and stayed there for roughly 2,000 years, give or take a few centuries, before we uncovered him. So why this one particular bog body raises some interest is that in comparing it with other Iron Age bog bodies, the Lindau Man's death was overkill. So, some attributed that to human sacrifice and ritual death. Celtic scholar Anne Ross figures that he was likely a sacrifice after identifying his stomach contents. They found what looked to be partially burned barley cake of sorts that was given to the chosen Celtic sacrifice victim. Think of it like drawing straws. You've got a portion of a cake that's burnt, you throw the whole thing into a bag, you rip it into pieces, throw it in a bag, and whoever draws out the burnt piece of cake is going to be the sacrifice. Now, they theorized that the Lindau Man was a druid who was sacrificed to stop a Roman advance on the Celts in 60 CE, after Rome became an empire. They also looked to the state of the body. The Lindau Man was in his mid-20s, but it looked like he had never done a day of hard work in his life, which lines up with him being a druid rather than a commoner who would have labored for a living. But apart from circumstantial evidence, we can't prove any of that. It's a really cool thought, though, and a very credible theory. The Lindau Man, by the way, is a permanent fixture at the British Museum in the Iron Age Gallery, so if you ever find yourself there and you want to check him out in person, Iron Age Gallery. So our evidence of Celtic human sacrifice is spotty. Some archaeological evidence certainly points to it, but we don't know for certain because most written sources are dubious and biased. Okay, then another question. Have we ever found evidence of a Wicker Man structure? That would certainly prove it, right? Or corroborate it even a little bit. So have we perhaps found a pit filled with like charred wicker remnants and maybe some bones? Quick answer here. No. There is no archaeological evidence to suggest a Wicker Man was ever built or used, except as a movie prop. There are also no eyewitness accounts of men being burned in a wicker structure, only hearsay evidence in very old sources. Alright, well, one final question then to fully explore this. If it didn't exist, then where do we get the classic image of the Wicker Man? Where does it come from? Because the one in the 70s film and the one in the Nick Cage film do look very much alike, so who dreamt that up if it wasn't real? Well, the modern image of the Wicker Man, popularized in the original 70s movie, comes from an 18th century engraving in Thomas Pennant's book, A Tour in Wales, or at least the illustrated version of it. But to be honest, I mean, look at this thing. It's not exactly a stable structure. Ignore the movies for a minute. Caesar described a large figure made of osiers with sacrifices stuffed in its limbs, right? That would have to be a monumental structure, and I'm doubtful that the Gauls would go to these lengths to burn a handful of men as sacrifices. There are easier ways for the druids to get the job done that's not so cinematic. So while The Wicker Man is a really cool visual, spawned some memorable movies, and is an icon attributed to the Gauls and more broadly Celtic druids, it's not real. It exists as a historical artifact of how the Romans othered the Gauls, but the thing itself is just fiction. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of The Wicker Man. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and subscribe to Af Out on YouTube and check out the musician behind the music for the podcast. You can find him everywhere as Nedrick and Nedrick Music. Links for all of that stuff is in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.